This is part 2 of a mini-series where I create a data visualization dashboard using Dash and Plotly. In the first part, I showed you how to set up a basic application that displays a couple of user interface elements and data. Now I'm going to add some complexity by loading a custom dataset, doing some processing on the data, and extend the capabilities of the dashboard. It's a really fun summer project to work on an application like this, so I hope you enjoy it too. Now, let's dive right back in. Where I've ended up in the first part was a simple Dash application that had a couple of components, a drop-down and a bar chart using some sample data. So today I want to take it up to the next level by loading data from a file and then displaying that in a bar chart. And I'm also going to add another type of chart, pie chart. So I have the data right here, which is in transactions. So this is simply a list of financial transactions. So there's a date, there's an amount in dollars, and there's a category that the transaction falls under. So I'm going to start building a simple financial dashboard today that's going to show these purchases, and then you can filter them using different drop-downs. So at the moment, my main file still looks exactly like it looked at the end of part 1, but I'm going to change it. I already changed the title into financial dashboard because this is going to be about finances and not about metals. But we also need to think a bit more carefully about how we're going to deal with data in the application, because each of the UI elements is going to need access to the data in some way. What I'm going to do is to pass the data to create layout, and then create layout can pass on the data to the different components that need to be rendered. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute, but first I'm going to create the data loading aspect of this application. So next to my components folder that I have here, I'm going to add another folder called data. And this is going to contain the code to load the data. So that needs an empty inner.py file. And then let's say I'm going to create a file called loader.py where I'm going to load the data. In order to load the data, I'm going to need pandas to process the comma separate file. And then I'm going to define a function, load transaction data, and it gets path, which is a string. And this is going to return a data frame. And in order to do that, I'm going to use the read CSV function. So I'm going to load the data from a CSV file. So that's pd.readCSV. And I'm going to supply the path. I can also supply a few other things, like what kind of data is in the CSV and how should it be represented in the data frame. So what I can do is define the D type, and then I can supply, for example, let's take a look at this data file. So there are three things. There's the date, there's an amount, and there's a category. So I can specify this by saying, well, amount, that's going to be a float. And category is going to be a string. And what I can do is indicate that I want pandas to parse the dates, and this is going to be the date file, and this should be in equals, like so. So this gives us our data, and then let's return that. So now basically you're done already, except we could make this a little bit cleaner. For example, the fact that this is named amount and category and dates is something we might want to put into a schema of some sort, so that we can use those values in other places as well if we need to access the data. So very simple way to do this is to simply create a class, let's call that data schema, where I'm going to store these standard values. So let's say we have amount, which is amount, and we have category, like so, and we're going to have date. So these are the elements of the schema that we have now. And then instead of writing amount here, I can write data schema dot amount. And that helps because then the IDE can help me fill in these things automatically. And let's do the same thing for the category. And we can also do the same thing for the date. There we go. Now, because pandas parses the dates, we can use that to extract some useful information from the dates. Because in the end, in my financial dashboard, what I want to have is several drop-downs. One where I can select the year of the transaction, one where I can select the month, and one where I'm able to filter on the categories. So in order to do that, I need to generate columns in my data frame to contain the years and the months. so that I can filter on them more easily. So what I can do is add those columns right here. So I'm going to take my data and I'm going to use data schema dot, and now I would like to add year and month. So let's add these two as well. So we have month, which is going to be month, and we have year, which is year, like so. And now I can use them here. So the year column, that's going to be data, and then we're going to take the date column and we're going to use the dt, which is the date time, and then we take the year and we want it to be a string. And the same thing I'm going to do for the month. So that's going to be the month, and here we need to change this also to month, like so. So now we're not just loading transaction data, we're also processing a bit. And in the final part of this series, I'm going to show you a nicer way to do this and also expand a bit on data processing more. But for now, let's keep it simple like this. In the main file, what we need to do is now load that data. So now what I'm going to do is use called the load transaction data that comes from data loader, and then I'm going to pass it the path to the data. Let's define a constant for that. There we go. And then let's take a look at the layout, which is what you see here. So at the moment, it just renders a year dropdown. And that component is actually really similar to what I had with the nation dropdown in part 1, except here I'm selecting years and not nations. So for now, I'm defining an all years list that contains 3 years, 2020, 21, 22. I made a unique version of this, which removes all the doubles. At the moment, that's not necessary, but if you're dealing with multiple transactions in the same year, you're going to need to do that. I have my div, which contains the dropdown, options, and the value, and I have a button to select all of them, exactly the same as before. And then I have a select all years callback that takes the select all years button number of clicks. So if you click that, this callback is called, and then I'm going to update the value in the dropdown. And this is what it looks like. I removed the bar chart for now because I'm going to do something different with that, but I can, just like before, remove these years and select all of the years. Now the thing is, I've loaded the data here, but we need some way to communicate the data to the different UI components. So you could make this a global variable and then you import it in various places, but it's also nice to pass this along the tree of components so that we could potentially replace it by something else, and then we don't have to fix all those imports of a global variable. So what you can do instead is add data to create layout. So I go to my layout, create layout, and then I'm going to add the data right here. Data, and that's going to be a pandas data frame. And now what I can do is also pass this along to the year dropdown. So it's now in create layout. Let's also add it here as an argument, like so. And then in my year dropdown, I'm also going to add the data. So that's right here. I'm going to add it as an argument. There we go. And now what I can do is all years I used a fixed list of years here. Here I can actually retrieve the list of years from the data itself. So then what I need to do is I need to access data, and I'm going to use the data schema that I defined, and then dot year, and I'm converting that into a list, like so. And now I also have my data schema import right there. And then finally, in layout, I need to pass the data along to my year dropdown. There we go. Now when I refresh the page, I'm getting the same years, but now they're being taken from the data, which is really neat. If I want to add a bar chart, it's going to be slightly different because I'm going to need to access the data. So I've created this function render already that gets the data as an argument, just like I did with the year dropdown. So what I need to do here is to create the bar chart like I did before in part 1, but make sure that I filter it based on the data that I get here as an argument. So to get started, let's create a callback, like so. And this is going to update the bar chart. So I'm going to need id.barchart, and it's going to update its children, just like I did in part 1. And now I'm also going to need the input, of course, which is going to be the year dropdown because we're filtering by year, and I'm going to need the value of this dropdown. So there we go. And now let's say we have the function update bar chart. And what I'm going to get is the number of years, which is a list of strings, like so. And it's not bar chart, it's bar chart. And this returns, just like before, a div, like so. So the first step is that I need to create the filter data. And because this is data frame, I can use the query method. And that's going to be year in years. So that's going to be my filter. And then let's also check if there is any data. So if filtered data shape 0, that's the dimensionality, equals 0, so there's no data selected, then we're just going to return html.div no data selected. There we go. And now we can create the bar chart again. Except the only issue is we need to create a pivot table first, because we need the mapping from categories to amounts. And the data contains more information than that. So I'm going to define a function here. Create pivot table, which is going to return a data frame, like so. And let's create that. And I'm going to use filtered data dot pivot table. And what is that going to get? Well, the values are going to be the amounts. So I'm using my data schema for that. So that's nice that I don't have to think about what the string value is. The schema helps me. And then the index, I want to index it by the data schema dot category. So I'm going to get the amounts per category. And how do I want to aggregate this? Well, I want to use the sum. So I want to see the total of the amounts for each category. If there is no value, let's say it's 0. And then let's also do some sorting. So I'm going to return pt, I'm resetting the index, and then I'm going to sort the values by amount. And I want the biggest amount first, so ascending equals false. So this is how I create the pivot table. And then creating the actual bar chart, let's say figure is px.bar. Very similar to what I did before. And what it's going to get is create the pivot table. The x is the category, and y is the amount. There we go. And I can also color the chart by using the category. So this ensures that every category is going to get a different color. So that's our figure. And then finally, I can return the div, which uses a dash graph. And I'm going to pass the figure and give it an ID. So that's the bar charts. There we go. So this is the basic setup of my bar chart. And then when I go to layout, I can add the chart here below this div with the dropdown. So I'm just going to add the bar chart. And this also needs the app as well as the data. And what I forgot to do was call the render function, like so. And this is what it looks like. I now have a bar chart where I have for each category, groceries, entertainment, etc. I have the amount, and the amount is descending in value. So the biggest one is first. And in the bar chart, I'm using filtered data. So I'm getting the years from the dropdown, which is what this input is doing. The bar chart is automatically updated when I change the years that I select. So I go back to my dashboard, and if I delete this year, for example, so now you see that the bar chart is being redrawn, and I can remove more, like so. I can remove even more, and now there is no data selected. Select all, so this all works perfectly fine. But I'd like a bit more flexibility, because now I can only select by year. Actually, if you look at the data, it might be nice that we could also select it by month or by category. So what I'd like to do is add a few more dropdowns where I can also select those things. And I already prepared that a bit. So here I have a month dropdown, which is very similar to the year dropdown, except that it selects the months. So I'm getting all the months, which I'm getting from the data, just like I did with the year dropdown. And I'm getting the unique values, so I won't have to select all the double months. I can select them all at once. And now at the moment I'm returning a div, which contains a drop-down and a button to select all of the months. So what I need to do here is create also a callback, just like I did with the year dropdown. But this callback is going to be slightly different. Let me first start by simply defining the callback like we did before. So that's a callback, and this is going to have an output, which is going to be the month dropdown values. Month dropdown and then the value. The question is, when should this callback be called? Well, one time it should be called is when we press the select all months button, right? So one input is going to be that button click. But the thing is, if you select different years in the other dropdown, it means we probably need to update this dropdown as well. Because if we remove a year, well, then we don't know which months are still remaining. So we need to update this dropdown. So we need two inputs. And this is also very easy to do in Dash. So I can use a list syntax for that, and I can just put the inputs in the list, like so. So I'm creating the first input, which is going to be the years dropdown. And I'm going to need the value. So whenever the value in the year dropdown changes, this callback is now also being called. And the second input that I want is the select all months button. There we go. And I'm going to listen to the number of clicks. And now let's define a function, update months. And what I'm going to get here is the years, the list of years that comes from the year dropdown, and I'm going to get the number of clicks. So that's going to be underscore, since I won't use this directly and it's an integer. And select all months, that's going to return a list of strings since we're updating the dropdown value. So now what we need to do is we have our data that we got here. So I'm going to create the filtered data, which is data.query. And then I want the year in the list, and then I'm going to return a sorted set of that filtered data, and I want the months, so I'm using the data schema dot month, and I'm turning that into a list. So that's going to give me the list of filtered months on the years. There we go. And when I go to my layout, I can now add the month dropdown. So that's month dropdown dot render app, and I also pass the data like so. And now when I refresh the page, we're going to see two dropdowns, the year and the month. So let's say I remove a couple of these months, and now when I remove a year, this is going to reset our month dropdown, which is really nice. The only thing is that currently the bar chart only listens to changes in the year dropdown and not in the month dropdown. So we still need to add that. So I'm going back to my bar chart, and what we can do now is not just listen to the year dropdown values, but also listen to the month dropdown value and also filter based on that. So I'm going to turn this into a list, and I'm going to add another input here, which is IDs.month dropdown. And I also want the value for that one. And this is also, there we go. So now I have two inputs, the year dropdown value and the month dropdown value. So I should also add the extra argument here. Months is a list of a string, just like I did with here. So how do we do the filter? Well, that's the cool thing about the query method. It's actually really easy to define this by saying, well, we have the year in years and month in months. And we're done. We've added the filter. So now refresh the page again. And now when I change the months, you see that the bar chart is being updated accordingly, which is really cool. And I select all, and it goes back to what we had initially. And of course, selecting and deselecting the years still works, so that's also pretty cool. So the final type of dropdown I want to add is a category dropdown. And here, I'm not going to go through the code in detail, but I followed exactly the same approach as with the year and months dropdown, except that the category I want to be reset if we change either the year or the months, because then we also don't know which categories are still going to be available. So I just add them here as an input. So the category callback has actually three different types of inputs: the year dropdown, month dropdown, and when I select all the categories. And then I'm simply computing the filtered data using query exactly like I did in other places. Now, if I want to add category filtering, of course, I need to update the bar chart. So here I'm going to also need to add the input and then IDs dot category dropdown. So I'm also going to need the value from here. And then when I update it, I'm going to get the categories here. Categories, which is also a list of strings. And then I just need to update the query to also take that into account. And categories in categories, like so. And then I add the category dropdown to the layout, like so. And now when I refresh the page, we're getting 3 dropdowns. And now I can delete things here. I can select things. I can also filter by category, which is also pretty cool. So this starts to look like a pretty neat little financial dashboard. Just to complete this part of the example, I also added a pie chart. And pie chart can be done in a very similar way to bar chart. You just have to create a different figure. But you see here I have an update pie chart callback that also gets years, months, categories, just like I did with the bar chart. I create the filter data and then I create the pie chart like this. And I'm using the data schema to get the filtered data that I need. The communication happens in exactly the same way. And for example, if I want to add the pie chart as well, I can do that right here. So I just say pie chart.render and I pass it the app and the data. And then when I go back to my dashboard, I now have 2 charts. So I have my bar chart and I have the pie chart right here. And whenever I change things here, well, both of these diagrams are going to be updated accordingly. So I hope this part gave you a bit more insight into loading data, processing and filtering data, and how to display it easily on a dashboard application. There's a couple of aspects of the application in terms of software design that I'm not really happy about at the moment. So in the last part, I'm going to change the design and show you how that works. And I'm also going to add some extra flexibility to the app and bring it a bit closer to what you would use in a production setting. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like. Consider subscribing to my channel if you want to learn more about software design and development. Thanks for watching, take care, and see you soon.